Hello, everyone. My name is Ray, and I'm here to introduce the policy presentation, Consent to Shelter, Youth Advocacy to Expand Rights of Minors Experiencing Homelessness in Maryland, Prince George County. And I am excited to talk about this policy. I would like to introduce those who have worked on this, Renee Pope, Dejanay Day, Kelly Gordon, and Ingrid Lofgren. I apologize if I pronounced anything wrong, but I'm really excited to talk to you about this application. So let's get started. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having us. Should we just get started? We have a little bit of a slide deck and then a video that we hope everyone will be able to see and hear. Should I just start with sharing screen? Thank you so much for having us. And I think, as Ray mentioned, we are going to be talking about the minor right to consent to shelter and expanding the rights of youth experiencing homelessness in Maryland. We are going to spend some time on this particular piece of legislation, but in order to give you a full and robust sort of sense of how we have been able to navigate a lot of opportunity here in the state of Maryland, and more particularly this county of Prince George's, we're going to add a few more things as bonuses to the conversation. Really look forward to engaging. So you have here today Dejanay Day, who is currently the navigator for our Youth Experiencing Success Center, which is a drop-in center focused on youth with who have been engaged in the foster care system or systems connected, and was the past chair of our Youth Action Board and a formative member in a lot of this work that you will see today. I'm Renee Pope. I'm the Deputy Director of Community Programs and Innovation at the Department of Social Services in Prince George's County, and also the Continuum of Care Lead for Homeless Programs in the county. With us, and I think she may be having technical difficulty, but at some point will rejoin the call, is Kelly Gordon, who's our team lead for youth and young adult homelessness with the Department of Social Services, and then the laudable Ingrid Lofgren, who's the director of the Homeless Youth Initiative with the Homeless Persons Representation Project, and really the author of some of these pieces of legislation that we'll be talking about. And so what we wanted to do is just sort of really quickly set context. I hope we deliver by the end of this presentation, really sort of looking at how we developed locally and examples of work where we engage to prevent and mitigate homelessness, particularly centered in some of our legislative work. Sort of lessons that we learned and things that adult providers and advocates might want to be paying attention to when they're developing your own policies and programs. And then really critically, the importance of meaningful power sharing with young people and continuous learning and adaptability. So those are the things that we hope you'll take away from this conversation, and hopefully some things that you can, some aha moments that you can adapt in your own work environments. So we're going to dive right in to the minor consent, the right to consent. And I'm going to turn it over to Ingrid to pick up this part of the conversation, and she'll lead you through the elements of legislation. And then we'll be talking shortly thereafter about the youth component in getting us to the finish line. Ingrid?
Thanks, Renee. So Maryland has a statute that gives minors who are not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian and experiencing homelessness legal capacity or the right to consent on their own to admission to an emergency shelter and to receive supportive services from that shelter provider. So just to give a little bit of context, this is a law that was established in 2020, a few years ago now. Data from public schools in Maryland around that time showed that thousands, almost 2,500 unaccompanied students experiencing homelessness had been identified in public schools, many of which were minors. So it was, widely known that there were young people under 18 homeless and on their own. At the same time, statewide, there were only 3 shelters serving minors. These were all federally funded basic center programs, so funded through the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, with a very limited number of beds, not accessible to youth in many parts of our state. And part of the reason that there were only these 3 federally funded shelters is that Maryland law at that time was completely silent on the rights of minors to consent to emergency shelter, as well as liability of shelter providers for serving minors. So I imagine you have a similar experience in Utah when you're talking about youth under 18 who aren't with a parent or guardian. Systems, providers can be very risk averse in terms of addressing their needs. So providers were reaching out to me, they were reaching out to the legislature asking, can we shelter minors? We don't know. So the driver of the legislation that created this law was really service providers coming forward and saying, hey, we need some clarity in the law to know whether we can meet this need. There were youth who were engaged with some of these service providers who are advocating, who also came to the legislature at the same time, but the impetus really was the providers' needs, the providers expressing their need for clarity in the law. So the process of this legislation getting passed, I'm going to try to be brief because I know we don't have a lot of time, was essentially that the legislation was first introduced in 2019. This was right after an election cycle. There were a lot of newer legislators who were also pretty risk averse about creating laws that gave rights to unaccompanied minors. They had a lot of questions. There was concern, questions about why aren't all of these young people in the child welfare system? Isn't that the solution for all young people? So it was a really important year for education around some of those issues, and youth were involved in that process. And then the bill was amended to create a work group to study the issue over the summer and come back with a recommendation the next year. So that work group met over the summer. It included representatives of all of the state agencies in Maryland that serve children and youth. It included representatives of local homeless services systems, including the Prince George's County Continuum of Care, and other service providers and stakeholders. It did not include youth with lived experience, which looking back was definitely a gap and something that I hope we've learned from. And I would definitely recommend, not having any work group like that without youth representation and youth voice. So that work group recommended that legislation be introduced again in 2020. And in that year, the bill did pass, establishing that minors can consent to emergency shelter with supportive services, that they can also consent to shelter and services on behalf of their own minor children who are with them. Some highlights from the bill: there's no lower age limit in Maryland for right to consent to shelter. We mirrored the federal regulations that govern the Basic Center program in several respects. And so that's how we kind of got that passed, is it actually mirrors federal regulations. There's no lower age limit. We also mirrored the federal law on contacting a parent, attempting to contact a parent or guardian within 72 hours, and some other aspects. So I'll leave it to the Q&A if there are other specific questions, and pass it over for a deeper dive into youth engagement in this process.
Hello again, everybody. Again, I'm Dejanay Day, and I'm the former chair for the Youth Action Board and currently with the Yes Center. This was a great experience for the Youth Action Board. We just came on board, started advocating on a local level. So when Ingrid came to us about the minors' right to consent bill, and we did our research and everything, this was something that we needed to advocate on as a group and to represent Prince George's County within this effort. To speak on the behalf of the Youth Action Board, I think this just brought us joy to know that this was the first step with having our voices being heard within a legislative background. So we had an opportunity to speak to senators and delegates during lobby day right before COVID hit. So that gave us that type of exposure that we needed. And then when we found out that it passed unanimously during COVID, we were psyched. We were very happy about that. And we were excited to advocate more. So that made us more hungry for the change.
And I think what Dejanay is sort of underplaying is the value that the youth had in getting this passed. When they first started talking about it, there were a number of legislators who were not inclined to pass the bill for one reason or another. And the vote is the actual vote is in the middle of our screen. You can't really see it, but it passed unanimously. And so a lot of that was due to the voices of young people speaking their truth and legislators being courageous enough to listen. I'm going to stop here for 1 second and play a video so you can hear directly from the youth that worked on this initiative, and then we'll come back to this slide presentation.
The purpose was to get information about the different aspects of being a foster youth.
The bill HB 206, SB 207 gives minors the right to consent themselves and put themselves into an emergency shelter without their parents' consent.
Yes, I did talk to last day. I talked to Delegate Patrick Young about my personal experience that I know he went through the same situation I'm going through or I went through.
I have talked with the legislators in Maryland about how I became to homelessness.
I personally didn't have an opportunity to speak to any of them. I was there. If I did have the opportunity, I would ask them to help, like youth, younger than me. Doesn't matter how old or how young.
I truly support family unification, but if all else fails, I want youth that are under 18 to be able to go into a shelter without feeling like they're not safe or anything.
It gives youth, like such as me, an opportunity for our voices to be heard. Because we usually can't tell everybody our voice. And usually it's either adults are like, oh, we know what's right for you, what's right for you, but you don't know what's actually right for us.
Yeah, it was one of the best experiences of my life. I got to talk to a whole lot of representatives and gave them my story and the stories of others that I've been touched by. And we testifying in front of everybody, but we had one-on-one meetings with some of the representatives, and I just told them just the general gist of what goes on in these neighborhoods that are really in need. And I didn't know where to begin. It was overwhelming. I wanted to tell them about everybody that I've met, all the people that I've came in contact with, but it was hard to choose. So I just, kept it general so that they had a good idea, a good image of what was going on. And so
I called my YAD members at 10 p.m. to tell them the news. And I was brushing my teeth and everything when I got the news. So just imagine me screaming in the bathroom. And everybody was like, are you okay? Did you fall?
I was elated. I was smiling the whole day. I told everyone in Promise Place, hey, the bill got passed. It's a great news. And I even reread the bill multiple times because I was so happy to hear that.
I was proud. Like, I was excited. They called me in the middle of me getting dressed, getting out shower. Cut that out.
power to get health care or to apply for benefits and things of that nature, especially if you're a homeless youth or if you're in social services. I couldn't explain. Growing up, I had no idea that I would be able to have that kind of impact. I didn't think my voice mattered. So now that it's crazy how life moves. all of our voices really matter.
So hopefully that was a teaser around how impactful both the process of engaging and partnering with youth can be in terms of delivering a successful outcome that improves their circumstances, but also how the sense of empowerment is so critical to their understanding that they have power and that their voice matters, and that when we listen, amazing things can happen. And so that sort of rounds out the tuition, the minor right to consent, but we wanted to leave you with a few more things we wanted to talk about. I think Ingrid mentioned that lessons learned, this process engaged youth at the end of the process, but not in the development of the actual legislation. It was really provider driven. And so subsequent to that, we had another legislative opportunity to right a wrong. And it's our tuition waiver in Maryland, which we're very proud of. And so I'm going to turn over to Ingrid to talk just a bit about tuition waiver, and then also Dejanay to lead us through the youth engagement. And so you can see in action how far we've come, and yet still so far to go. Ingrid?
Thanks. So back in 2014, Maryland became one of the first states in the country to establish a tuition waiver for unaccompanied youth experiencing homelessness to attend public colleges and universities in the state. So this was another bipartisan effort that was really celebrated. We were very proud. And then over a number of years of implementation, we started to hear from youth and students, hey, there are some things about this law that are really not working for us, and actually that are undermining the intent of this law. So the driver of legislation to reform and improve Maryland's tuition waiver law in 2021 was really youth with lived experience. So in 2021, another law was passed that really improved the tuition waiver, removed some of the aspects of the law that were not working for young people, and expanded eligibility significantly. So in 2014, the waiver law applied only to unaccompanied youth experiencing homelessness. Now the waiver is available to any young person experiencing homelessness, whether they're with their family or on their own, who has experienced homelessness within the 24-month period prior to enrolling in college. So it's not even like, where'd you sleep last night? It's the 24 months prior to applying. It also created an on-campus housing priority for youth. It requires that every 2-year and 4-year public institution of higher education in Maryland has to have a staff person identified as a liaison for students experiencing homelessness. And these were all things that Dejanay and other students and youth said were really important to them. And I think because of that context of youth saying, hey, this is what we need for this to actually achieve the goal, that resulted in youth with lived experience really driving the process more and being part of the whole legislative process, from, doing research, drafting legislation, working in coalition, all the way through the legislative session and into implementation. And so I'm going to pass it back over to Dejanay again to talk in more detail about the scope of that engagement.
All right. Hello again, everybody. So with the youth engagement, I came in with my own personal experience with experiencing the tuition waiver bill before it got amended in 2021. With the old tuition waiver, I had to apply every year to receive the waiver through my school. And that was difficult for me because going from Eastern Shore to the homeless shelter back and forth, I may have lost some documents that were very important to give the FAFSA, the school, and everything. So when Ingrid came to me with the potential to amend the bill, I was all on board with advocating for the changes to the bill. So with that, we had an opportunity to meet with providers weekly to train providers regarding the legislation that was in the past that got passed in 2014, and also the potential changes that we were advocating on to be changed. So with that, we provided workshops to higher ed providers and youth serving providers to write their own testimonies for the bill and to also learn about the bill, because some providers and some partners still did not have any knowledge of the tuition waiver and in its extent. So everybody knows COVID-19 happened around this time. So luckily with Maryland legislators, we were able to do a virtual testimony as well as a written testimony. So I was able to do a testimony on the behalf of the Youth Action Board to talk about the importance of the tuition waiver, and also again to give my personal testimony on why these changes were needed within our system. So that ended up passing, and now we started doing the implementation design, which discusses the policy, the outreach to students that do not know about the tuition waiver, and the new guidelines that was implemented with the amended bill. Excuse me. We did large group trainings with state colleges and universities to let them know about the update. And we also continue to educate the youth and young adults, especially those that are in emergency shelters, transitional houses, that there is an opportunity for them to get an education tuition free if they're up for the challenge.
I'm going to just quickly highlight 2 additional slides. I know we want to leave time for questions, and we started a bit late. So I just want to flag that really critical lessons we continue to learn are around youth agency, the desire and ability of young people to make decisions and drive change, really embracing that concept, youth choice around our program designs and how we deliver services, to provide as many options as possible for young people to decide what works best for them. Really, youth engagement, I think, is where a lot of communities are, bringing youth to the table around a specific issue, but to truly share power, to truly give space and step out of the space and allow for youth leadership, while difficult, is really where we are working to be as a community. And that's where you see real change happen, is when you stand shoulder to shoulder with a young person and you share that power opportunity to create change. I can tell you, after a decade of working with young people, particularly in this space, that we're always better off for having released power and lifted up youth in that process. And so that's just a quick snapshot of a bunch of the things that our Youth Action Board, they're always on the go, they're always involved, they're always evolving. Dejanay, I'm going to give you a minute, because we're going to have to turn the mic back over in a couple of minutes, to just kind of quickly highlight, to just give people a sense of how engaged at a local level a Youth Action Board is and can be. So I'm going to turn that over to you, Dejanay, to just kind of pull a few things out of here and give people a teaser of how great Youth Action Boards can be.
All right, thanks. So a quick overview of the Youth Action Board in Prince George's County, Maryland. We again was established in 2019 in order to provide youth a voice to advocate for ending youth homelessness within our county. So with the Youth Action Board, we have partnered with a lot of organizations such as MMYC, our local colleges, and our sports and learning complexes in order to gain that community engagement and to advocate over there as well. For, again, the advocacy, we have worked strongly with the Prince George's County Health Department with their GOAT Expo, with their mental health trainings, especially around COVID-19. And we have also the point in time count in which we go out in the community and we provide outreach to those that are literally like homeless, like on the street, and they have no shelter. So we do that within the month of January. And that's one piece that tugs on like my heart and makes that advocacy work that I do really means something. Personal experience is one thing, but really going out on the field and helping out others, that fills my hunger and my emotion for advocating. But we also do TD building and training activities such as lived experience academy trainings and adulting one-on-one, which goes over, how to review your taxes and financial literacy and how to come to an interview and everything like that. I know we're limited on time, but these are some of the snapshots of what we do within the Youth Action Board.
Thanks, Dejanay.
No problem.
Youth Action Board is amazing. As you know, I always defer and value sitting in a room with you all, being allowed to sit in the room with you all, because sometimes we're not, and that's okay too. Just one quick final slide, just some quick teasers for takeaways that might be of value to you as you're navigating where you are now in incorporating youth voice and youth action in policy and practice. A lot of things we've done to center youth voice. We pay our Youth Action Board members just like we would pay a professional staff member for their time. They bring lived expertise to the table. So we compensate them for that. We have a couple of paid agency positions that we've dedicated solely to be youth advocates and to work in this space that are also opportunities for young people, and where we're putting our money where our mouth is in this work. A lot of this work has resulted in, as a community, accessing funding resources that were not there previously. So we're a youth homeless demonstration grant program site. We are most recently a prevention demonstration pilot. So we'll be looking over a 3-year period at a lot of secondary intervention prevention strategies and hoping to inform some national best practice. Youth have been tremendously engaged in all of this. None of our providers have contracts unless they're interviewed and vetted by the Youth Action Board. And if the Youth Action Board discounts them as a possible vendor, they don't even get to the second level of consideration. So there really is power in the room. We've gotten a Healthy Transitions grant, pretty large, Systems of Care expansion grant, both from SAMHSA, to really expand our work in this space. And we're currently piloting a guaranteed basic income, which is a financial strategy targeted for youth with who are systems connected. So a lot of funding can come from this work if you're willing to make the investment up front. Lots of partnerships, Dejanay touched on those. Clearly, I hope you walk away from this understanding the value of the advocacy of youth voice and the expertise of youth in the room, because we really do value nothing about us without us. That is a mantra that we hold very close to our heart, and we work every day to hold that value and to be good at it, and we don't always succeed, and our youth board lets us know. And I think that that's important to say. You're not going to be perfect the first time or even the 41st time, but as long as you keep trying, you'll get there. So we're just going to turn it over for questions. I know we came on late and Jessica's flagging us, so I'm going to stop the sharing here and open the space for whatever people are interested in asking us about.
Thank you so much for all your great work. Both the Youth Action Board and the adults who have been involved in this, I think these are really important policy changes, and especially the tuition waiver. That's something that, even though I'm involved with a Youth Action Board in Columbus, that's not, that's like a novel idea to me, so that's just really amazing. And I also appreciate the self-awareness and the reflection in that the youth voices are important in the entire process. And I definitely see how you are striving towards further youth involvement, so I really appreciate that. I do have some questions before I turn it over to the rest of the youth on the panel. First, I was wondering, I was a little unsure about the involvement of like child protective services in situations of abuse. And I wanted to like highlight in my question, we know that up to 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ, and people who are trans and non-binary youth, they're especially vulnerable to abuse and, you know, being kicked out of their homes. That's something that I nearly experienced. I've experienced homelessness myself twice. So I was just wondering if there's anything that you're doing to make sure that those who are like especially vulnerable to abuse are getting the support that they need, and are they like allowed to stay sheltered while the Child Protective Services process is ongoing?
Yeah, maybe I can briefly say how that was kind of taken into account in the process of the minor shelter law. And then if someone else wants to jump in to talk about what you're doing in implementation in Prince George's County. So thank you, Ray, and call me about the tuition waiver. But thanks for this really important question. So an issue that we were having in Maryland is that although many people were saying, you know, the child welfare system is the answer, there are many youth experiencing homelessness who are not being served by the child welfare system, who were either appropriately or inappropriately screened out of that system based on findings of whether they were being abused or neglected. So in Maryland, homelessness in and of itself does not constitute abuse or neglect, but of course, there are oftentimes other factors along with homelessness that do rise to that level, right? So first, we needed to establish that there are young people who need to be served outside of child welfare. And sometimes those are trans young people and LGBT young people, right? Our Child Protective Services system, and I'm based in Baltimore City, so I'm not talking so much about Prince George's County. I'm talking about my experience in Baltimore, but CPS might call a parent or guardian, and if they said, yeah, he can come home as soon, you know, as long as he stops acting like a girl, right? Or uses the right name, right? And Child Protective Services would find that there's not abuse or neglect because the parent said their child could come home, when clearly we would say, you know, and I'm alluding to gender identity and expression, right? That is not a safe place. If your parent is saying you can only come home if you use the name and pronouns and wear the clothing and present your gender in the way they want you to, right? So we had to do a lot of education around that, and just kind of tease out how community-based programs and child welfare can coexist and partner so that young people always have a place to go. And young people do stay in community-based shelters while the child welfare process, you know, is kind of getting worked through. And Maryland's consent to shelter law doesn't supersede our mandatory reporting law for child abuse and neglect, right? Anytime there's any reason to suspect abuse or neglect, the child welfare system has to be contacted. So I hope that answers some of your question, and I'll pass it off to talk about kind of what that looks like in implementation of shelter.
I'll pick up real quickly on that one, right? The Department of Social Services is also the Public Child Welfare Agency, as well as a continuum of care lead for homelessness. So we had a unique opportunity to really understand the complexities of how young people navigate spaces, and what systems might be best to intervene at what points in time. And so we actually have staff that are co-trained in both the youth homelessness system service package as well as the child welfare package. We adopt in the homeless system a lot of reunification work, safety reunification, safety planning. As long as we can acquire, or because of the minor right to consent, we are allowed to continue to serve a young person in shelter. We do a lot of work around fictive kin identification, other safe spaces where young people might identify, and really working with families to help with that navigation, or to identify where there's particular crises or incidences or challenges that are creating tensions in the household that make it unsafe for a young person to return. We've had young people who have actually come to the shelter in a coordinated fashion, pathwayed into child welfare, and then an immediate placement with their fictive kin of choice. So they don't actually spend any time in foster care, but the caring adult and support mechanism that wants to step forward for the rest of their life is identified, and then we collectively as a child welfare system navigate what that home clearance needs to look like while ensuring the young person is in a safe space during that transition. Our prevention demonstration project, which is new, we're one of 11 across the country, and we identified 2 populations for intensive work. LGBTQIA+ was one, and our foreign-born Latinx population, in our case, we're the largest BIPOC community in the country. Well, it might be second now, but we're over 87% BIPOC. And so we have complexities within our communities of color that we really needed, and we're one of the largest thoroughfares for minor foster care youth being returned to the United States, that we are disproportionately impacted by that. And so we see that as a driver of youth homelessness, and we want to avoid that trauma whenever possible, helping young people navigate systems regardless of their legality in the United States. They're all, at this point, they're our residents, our youth, and we need to engage. So we're really hyper-focused on that. I think it's an excellent question. We don't have the perfect answer, but we have some answers because we get to tell ourselves what to do as an agency, which is a little different in communities where it's not one department. But it's a work in progress, for sure.
Yeah, thank you so much for that information. I think it's really important, the work that you're doing. I have a question for Dejanay. Actually, since it was noted that there's still work to be done to amplify youth voices, I was wondering if you, as someone who has been on the Youth Action Board, what your feedback is in general to how youth voices can be amplified and how youth can be empowered in this work.
I believe the youth voice is pretty amplified within the Youth Action Board, I can say. With the testimonies that we provided with legislative work, and then the local policies and the local community engagement that we do. I say that youth voice continues to grow within what happens within society. So I can say personally, what happened when I was homeless may not apply to homeless youth today. So so my belief is continuing to pass the torch along to any chair or any member that comes into the Youth Action Board, and for youth and providers to have a non-biased mind, an open mind to what comes, and not judge people's stories, because everybody's testimonies are different. So just going with the times.
Just to piggyback on that a little bit, that makes me think, Dejanay, about the testimony writing workshops that you talked about earlier during the tuition waiver effort. So especially because that was during COVID, it was a harder time for youth to get connected to the advocacy and legislative process. And I really appreciated that the Youth Action Board, which is a small group, was really committed to trying to get input from young people who weren't on the Youth Action Board, who might have different experiences, like Dejanay was just saying. So this kind of like peer-to-peer outreach. And we were just chatting earlier today about like the vibes when the YAB led those sessions and how comfortable everyone was and how collaborative it was. And youth who participated ended up writing, some wrote their own testimony, some wrote group testimony, and kind of wove all of their perspectives and voices together into this group testimony. I think that's a great example of the Youth Action Board kind of reaching out beyond its members to help more youth participate, which was awesome.
And it also reminds me of the work you're doing now, Dejanay, on the social media platform, the website, in terms of vetting providers, making sure that when a referral is made, that it's actually to a warm transfer, training the providers to take that backdoor transfer, making sure that the social media outreach and inreach with young people is in live time and young people can get connected no matter what issue they're bringing to the table. And that's a piece of work that's been going on for about a year. So hopefully in the next 6 months, we'll be at a launch point. But it was right from the design straight through to what needs to be on the website, how it needs to be on the website, has been driven by the YAB.
Yep, and the language that goes into the website and what providers need to do in order to match the goals of the Youth Homeless Demonstration Project and the Youth Action Board as a whole.
Thank you all for your insight. I'd like to pass it to the other youth on the panel to see if there's any other questions.
I think the mic is on now. Thank you so much for your presentation. I saw a lot of intersections with both human rights and child rights as well. So I think that's definitely more conversations and actions that we need to have to promote those opportunities. And kind of going to the beginning of the presentation, there were points around there only being 3 shelters that were centered around this age range in particular. So I was curious with this legislation, if there has been additional efforts or talk around providing extra funding for those 3 organizations or for additional organizations to provide or to better provide support for the youth population or unaccompanied youth. I think that is a huge aspect where sometimes policy doesn't always match practice on the ground. So I'm curious if there's been any movement or momentum to ensure that those organizations can adequately have the funding and sustainability to support unaccompanied minors as well.
I don't know. I think Prince George's County is doing a good job with this. So I was trying to pause and let them share. But for me in Baltimore, Brandon, you just like cut right to it. Like that challenge is right where we're at still, even with this law. We don't unfortunately have a lot of providers who are applying for existing funding, and the funding isn't really sufficient to cover the costs of a good program, right? Of a robust program. The federal funding that is available is really limited. So we're really trying to work locally to outreach to providers to say, hey, you can do this. There's this need, there's this law, but we do need more funding. And so much of the effectiveness of this advocacy lies in those implementation challenges that you were just describing. So unfortunately, yes, exactly what you said is kind of what we're experiencing. Prince George's County had a youth shelter already, was one of the only places in the state that had one of those 3 youth shelters and has continued to draw in a lot of resources very effectively. I don't know if you want to add anything, Renee.
Sure, thanks. You're right. It's a heavy lift, right? And in addition to, it's not just about funding, right? It's about developmentally appropriate, safe, and non-traumatizing environments that allow young people to navigate when they're in a state of crisis and to be able to feel safe enough to take advantage of what resources might be available, right? So from a structural perspective, it comes down to not just mapping funding, and there are a lot of different ways to map funding. We've created some of our own with a juror program where jurors can donate their daily wage and it goes into a fund that allows us to do really non-traditional things that government doesn't typically fund to support young people. So we've been able to do some really creative things with that. We use some of our child welfare money when we have crossover youth. I mentioned the youth homeless demonstration program. Because of the work, we were able to bring in just under $1.8 million. That's an annual renewal amount for the county. And with that funding, we've gone to scale a little bit. Emergency shelter is sort of one part of the answer, but it's not a home. It's not a long-term solution for young people, right? It's supposed to be a stepping stone where we catch you when nobody else caught you on the way down. And now we help you get to the next place, right? We put our shoulder to the wheel with you, embrace what it is that you want for yourself, and then we help you figure out how to get there, right? Like that's the goal. So for us, we added street outreach specifically for youth and young adults, and the outreach workers are youth and young adults with lived experience, right? Because we believe highly in putting our money where our work is. And so we do a lot of hiring of young people, right? Because it's hard to stabilize when you don't have an income, and there's value that you bring to the table that others can't bring. So we've added drop-in centers where sometimes young people are not really comfortable going to a shelter, but they need still a place to connect with a caring adult and services that they feel like they can trust. We've added some transitional and rapid rehousing. We've even added one permanent supportive housing for young people that have really significant somatic or behavioral health challenges and can't necessarily stabilize on their own right now. So we're adding those types of projects, but to the point, it's still a response system, right? The act of homelessness has occurred in every one of those instances, right? And so what's exciting about where we are now in the next phase is really looking at prevention. How do we go upstream and begin to provide interventions in the pathways that a young person might have to navigate on their way to homelessness? And how do we put the gate up before they actually become homeless? So it's homeless response, right? And going after funding and really fighting for funding. We go after general fund money. We lobby, we go after capital funding to build. We look at surplus property. I mean, there's a lot of things that communities can do collectively to really embrace. We partner with our housing authority to have set-aside vouchers. We use our youth vouchers. And so how do we create this sort of sustainable journey and pathway for young people wherever they are in that continuum? I don't know if that answers your question, but I think you have to be intentional and you have to be a champion of the work. It is not easy, and you're going to have to do a lot of talking other people into giving you money and doing stuff and sharing stuff. That's not easy across systems, but it's necessary. So we still have ours. It's partially basic center funded, but then we have county government money that we've added to it to go to scale. We've also taken all of our adult shelters and done a lot of developmental training with them so that if a young person has to land in a shelter that wouldn't, because the youth shelter is full, that the services and the compassion and the trauma are able to be delivered within a different structure if need be. So really starting small, but building everyone's capacity as you go along so that there really isn't a bad place for a young person to land, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you so much. And as a public health professional, love a good upstream approach, so appreciate that. Thank you.
I think that we only have a couple of minutes left. I just wanted to thank you for your presentation and for everything that you shared. I think that the work that you're doing is really vital. And I don't know if we have time for like an audience question because there's only maybe one. Okay, we can do one audience question.
Okay, I work with youth and young adults experiencing homelessness. And I just kind of wanted to see if you could share a little bit more about what housing programming looks like for minors, as far as signing leases, what programs allow, yeah, because the right to consent allows for shelter stays, but how does that look when it comes to other services that are needed for those youth?
Yeah, that's a really complex question. But some of our longer term housing programs, we work with our providers around master leasing, and then we create unit occupancy agreements with young people who are minors that perhaps may or may not have the right to sign their own lease, so that they actually have a lease, if you will, a sublease, if you will, occupancy agreement that is in their name, that they have a financial responsibility for supporting. Sometimes you have to navigate it differently depending on their age. So sometimes our providers will actually do the master leasing and then do occupancy leases, if you will, room leases that have obligations, set terms, a lot of things that they might do in a like in a dormitory setting or on a campus setting where multiple young people rent rooms, if you will, where the actual landlord is not is the program, if that makes sense. So sometimes we're able to be really creative that way. Ingrid, you might know how some other parts of the state are sort of working around that, but we just do it till they tell us like, we can't, really. That's our approach.
Yeah, I think a lot of other parts of the state aren't really figuring it out. I think Prince George's County has really been a leader in trying different approaches. And unfortunately, we don't have the right to contract for minors in Maryland, nor do we have a statutory emancipation process. So those are both things that there's a lot of conversation around. Minors can get emancipated through a court process in Maryland, but it's not a process that is often very helpful to a lot of the youth who we collaborate with, who don't have income. So there are a lot of challenges.
Thank you. I think that that's about it. We're at time, but I really appreciate all your hard work, and I'm cheering you on as you continue to do the work that you're doing, especially with the Youth Action Board. I think that that's great. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and yeah, I look forward to the next presentation.
Thanks for having us. We appreciate it. Thank you.